Well, greetings once again from sunny Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, and also site of a virtual field trip today, a special program, Baseball Stamp Collecting. We're glad to have with us Librarian Emeritus of the Hall of Fame, Jim Gates. He'll be joining us momentarily. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bruce Markison. I work in the education department here at the Hall. May have heard recently the news about the new Yogi Berra stamp just issued by the post office in late June. We'll be talking about that and other historical baseball stamps, baseball theme stamps, stamps featuring individual star players, including a number of Hall of Famers. We'll do that with Jim Gates. Jim has a special presentation planned for us. Then when Jim's presentation is done, I'll have some questions for him. We'll take questions from the audience in our Zoom group chat. Before we officially welcome Jim to the program, we do want to thank the Ford Motor Company for making this and all of our other virtual programs absolutely free of charge. So we do appreciate the Ford Motor Company. We welcome Jim Gates back to the Hall of Fame, enjoying retirement in Florida, where it's days filled with 18 holes of golf, time at the beach, the swimming pool, afternoon tea, lots of sun. Did I get all that right, Jim?
Yeah, you hit on all of them.
How are things going for you down there?
I'm getting used to the rhythms of retirement. It took a while, but I'm starting to enjoy it. I have a good friend that lives down here. We try to go golfing once or twice a week, and I'm to the point now where I am no longer a total embarrassment to the game of golf. Although if I'm hitting the ball, you don't want to be standing within a 90-degree arc of where I'm aiming. That's for sure.
So it sounds like you like it down there.
Yeah, I'm in Gainesville, home of the University of Florida, and I was staff librarian here 26 years ago when I took the job up in Cooperstown. So I have friends down here. It's an area I'm familiar with. I have some family nearby, so it's been a very smooth transition for us, and my wife and I are really enjoying it down here.
Very good. I'm curious, were you able to go to any spring training games this year?
I did not go to spring training games, but I was able to attend 3 or 4 Florida Gator baseball games. The brand new ballpark, they spent $160 million building that thing, and it's an absolute palace for college baseball, and it's only 15 minutes from my front door, so we get over there as often as we can.
Very nice. Jim was the librarian here at the Hall of Fame for 25 years, retired in October of 2020, and has been settled in Florida ever since. We're glad to hear things are going well for you down there. Jim, I'm going to turn the program over to you at this point. You do have a special presentation that looks at the history of baseball-themed stamps, not only American stamps, but also some stamps issued in other countries. And then we'll be back with some questions from myself and from the audience. But we'll turn things over to you now. Take it away as you give us a sampling of the history of baseball stamps.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'm very happy to do this. I've been a stamp collector since the 1960s. It was once the most popular hobby in the world, certainly in the United States. Not so much anymore, but I've stayed involved with it. I'm a member of the American Philatelic Society. I like to visit postal museums when I travel. I guess I'm a bit of a nerd, but it's a fun collecting hobby to have. And for those of you who are baseball card collectors or baseball memorabilia collectors, and you're not collecting baseball stamps, it's an area that's wide open to a lot of fun activity, and I would encourage you to look at it. And what I'm going to do today is basically do a general background on baseball stamps, focusing on a few of the early American issues, talk a little bit about the foreign stamps. There have been over 1,000 baseball stamps issued worldwide, so there's no way that we could get through those in 20 or 25 minutes. So we'll talk about some of the early ones. Now, the most recent one, of course, is the Yogi Berra stamp. issued here in the United States. And I think, Bruce, you recently had a program with Yogi's daughter where you talked about this. It's a very attractive stamp. And when you look at it, I've already got one for my collection. I'm sure I'll be adding more. But this is just the most recent in a series of baseball stamps produced by the United States. It's a fun one, but let's go back and kind of start at the beginning. Stamps can trace their history back to 1840 when this stamp, it's known as the penny black because of its color and the fact that it was sold for a penny. This is from Great Britain. It was created after a schoolmaster by the name of Rowland Hill proposed and really pushed the idea of getting a stamp that one could attach to a letter and prepay for postage, because prior to this, you would put a letter in the mail and it would be delivered and the person receiving it would have to pay for the delivery. And that wasn't working out. The post offices were losing money, and they adopted Rowland Hill's idea. He's now become probably one of the more famous names in the history of philately. He was knighted. He is now Sir Rowland Hill. This stamp was produced on large sheets. The letters at the bottom, in this case S and C, indicate the row and column that the stamp appeared on. You would cut the sheet yourself with a pair of scissors, and there was no adhesive in those days, so you would have to use glue to stick it to the envelope. And this is in 1840, and the idea was, it really took off, well liked by countries around the world. And in 1847, the United States issued its first postage stamp. This was a 5-cent stamp featuring Benjamin Franklin. He was selected, of course, because he was the first Postmaster General of the United States, going back to the founding of the country. This is in, as I mentioned, 1847, and this overlaps with the basically the early days of baseball history, the first teams, town ball appearing in different places in the United States, being played regularly, the game becoming more popular. And so what this means is that baseball and stamp collecting, or baseball and postage stamps, kind of grew up together. They appeared around the same time, and they've been with us ever since. Now, the first baseball stamp did not appear for quite some time. It was 1934. There is some controversy on this because it was produced in the Philippine Islands as part of the Far Eastern Championship Games. This was the 10th Far Eastern Championship Games in 1934, held in Manila in the Philippine Islands. This round of championship games, there were only 4 participants. They were China, Japan, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. The games had started in 1913, and this was the final game. They were scheduled to be held in Japan in 1938, but due to the conflicts brewing that led up to World War II, those games were canceled, and the championships were never begun, although they were replaced by the Asian Games, which appeared after World War II. These games included a variety of swimming and track and field events, but they also had some team sports like basketball and baseball. And this stamp was produced, the 2-cent orange, celebrating the baseball games being played in this tournament. And the controversy stems from the fact that this, although it was issued in the Philippines, it was issued by the United States government because they were occupying the Philippines in 1934. So in the philatelic world, this is considered a Philippine stamp. And if you look up the Scott catalog, which is the go-to source for these things, this is a Philippine Island stamp. But there are some proud Filipinos who consider this to be an American stamp because it was issued by the US government and not by a Philippine government. So there's always controversy, as there's some controversy with where baseball was founded and who founded it. The same type of controversy exists with what is the first baseball stamp. Now, the first issue that appeared in the United States was the Centennial of Baseball stamp. This came out on June 12th, 1939. It was issued the first day covers in Cooperstown, New York. It was a very popular stamp. June 12th, 1939, for those of you who are baseball historians also know that that is the day the Baseball Hall of Fame opened. So the two occurred simultaneously in the village of Cooperstown. Now, there were 81 million of these stamps produced, which at the time was a very, very high number. The stamp itself was controversial. Prior to this, there had been no sporting stamps issued. I've been to the National Postal Museum Library in Washington, D.C., and have reviewed the files on this stamp, and it appears there was a lot of opposition, both in the philatelic world, from Congress, with a variety of letters and editorials coming out that no sport or sporting figure should appear on a postage stamp. That should be left just for presidents to appear. But the Postmaster General at the time, James Farley, was a huge baseball fan. He came out of the Hudson Valley in New York. And the president at the time was Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt is, for me, the second most famous stamp collector in baseball history. I'll leave you to think about who the first most famous stamp collector is. And maybe, Bruce, you can check in with me on that at the end of the program. But Franklin Roosevelt took great interest in the stamps that the country was producing. He had a monumental collection of stamps himself. And Farley basically sketched out a drawing of some boys playing a game of baseball in the sandlot. And he gave it to Roosevelt, who made some editorial changes to it. And that went over to the Postal Service to be produced as a stamp, where it was designed by William A. Roach. The final design was put together. And some of the controversy occurred in that early sketch that Farley presented to President Roosevelt. Farley, being an Irish Catholic, you'll see in the background there is a church. And Farley just, without taking it as a big issue, he put a crucifix on top of the steeple, which Roosevelt deleted from the sketch, saying that might be, that people might find that offensive and it shouldn't appear on a stamp. And William Roach in the final design, along with an Italian-American whose name I can never remember, who did the engraving, they solved the issue by putting the church right at the top of the stamp so that the top is lopped off. And so you don't know what type of church it is. And so that controversy was kind of eliminated in that fashion. But this is a monochromatic purple. Like I said, a very popular stamp. And when the first day of issue came about on June 12th, Farley came to Cooperstown, and that is James Farley on the left, Postmaster General of the United States, at the Cooperstown Post Office, which is directly across the street from the Baseball Hall of Fame, right on Main Street. And he is selling the first sheet of the Centennial of Baseball stamps to Commissioner Landis. And to Landis's right, who you can't see very well, is Ford Frick, National League president, who was one of the driving forces behind the creation of the Baseball Hall of Fame. And Commissioner Landis, after purchasing that sheet of stamp, walked across the street and donated it to the museum, where it exists today as the first philatelic item in the library collection. There is a scan of that sheet of stamps, and you can see the handwriting on the left edge, and it matches the handwriting in the photograph that was taken that day. Very big day in Cooperstown history, obviously, and in Baseball Hall of Fame history, but also a big day in philatelic history. And there are some fun stories about the stamp. A first day of issue cover is where you put the new stamp on an envelope. You take it over to the post office where the first day of issue is occurring, and they have a special cancellation. They're quite fancy these days, but back in 1939, it would have given you the time, the date, Cooperstown, New York, as you see in the circle, and then you can see where it says first day of issue to cancel out the stamps. This is known as a block of 4 cancellation, and it has the Centennial of Baseball logo on the left-hand side. When there's artwork on the envelope, it's often referred to as a cachet. This was one of the more popular ones. There are several samples of this in the Hall of Fame collection. I have also found some on eBay and purchased them over the years for my personal collection. But this is just a fun type of stamp to collect. But as far as this cachet is concerned, I have identified over 125 different decorated cachet envelopes that appeared that day. That some have the first day of issue cancellation, some do not. Here are some samples of those. I really like the one on the left because that is an actual photograph that is glued to the envelope of the Christy Mathewson bust, which is also part of the Hall of Fame's art collection. Now, back in the day, and you can still do this currently, you would send an envelope, you would mail a self-addressed envelope to the post office where the first day of issue is going to occur. You include the cost of postage for the new stamp, and at the post office, they will put the stamp on your envelope. They will then put the appropriate first day of issue cancellation on it and mail it to you. And there are collectors who do nothing but go after first day of issues, and they're a very popular part of it. But what happened in Cooperstown is kind of unique because of the popularity of the stamp and the popularity of the game with children. Postmaster Melvin Bundy in Cooperstown received thousands of envelopes from children asking for a first day of issue cover, but they forgot to put the 3 cents in to pay for the postage and to mail it back to them. And not wanting to disappoint all these children, Melvin was a member of the Cooperstown Rotary Club, as was I, and Bruce has been a member of the club as well. It consists of a lot of local businessmen and women. And what Bundy did was he organized the Rotarians to take up a collection among the businessmen and businesswomen in Cooperstown. They came up with $1,500, which in 1939 is a bundle of cash. And they used that money to cover the cost of the 3 cent postage stamps to make sure that every child who asked for a first day cover got one in the mail. And that's just a fun story. I don't think that would happen today, but in 1939, it's just part of the folklore of the Centennial of Baseball stamp. Another thing you can do is you don't have to put an envelope in the mail. You can create your own sheet or cachet. And I have a lot of these in my collection where I've created something and walked across the street to have with the appropriate postage on it, to have the post office stamp it for me on a given day. Some I send to other collectors, some I've put into the Baseball Hall of Fame stamp collection. This is just a small 4x6 sheet that has the stamp on it that was postmarked on June 12th and is kind of just a fun piece to have. So you don't have to put things on envelopes. You can create the items yourself. Now, the second stamp is something of an accident. In the 1960s, what has happened is chromolithography has gotten to the point where you no longer had to have single color or just 2 colors on a postage stamp. You could put a lot of colors on a stamp. And so they had a series of stamps that came out starting in the early 60s and running to the end of the decade, celebrating American artists. One of those was the renowned folk artist, Grandma Moses, who painted this image, which is called July 4th, and it's meant to celebrate all the good things that she remembered from her childhood as part of a July 4th celebration in a small village. And you can see a lot of the American flags and the parade and everything else. But if you look closely, and let me go to the next slide here, I've made a cutout of the center. There are some boys playing a game of town ball or stickball or baseball or whatever they would have called it in that town. And this is the second appearance of baseball on a U.S. postage stamp. Now, quite often this stamp gets forgotten about and is not included in baseball stamp listings, but it should be there because that's just part of the artwork and it's part of the stamp. And I think it's just a fun piece and a very colorful stamp to have in the collection. Now, the next baseball stamp that came out was in 1969 as part of the celebration of the centennial of professional baseball, which at the time was dated to the Cincinnati Team in 1869, which is still considered by many to be the first openly professional team. The first day cover for this one was held in Cincinnati, Ohio, in honor of the Cincinnati Redlegs team. And Bowie Kuhn was involved in this stamp and promoting it, and his papers donated to the Hall of Fame Library have a significant file on this stamp. But you can see it's very bright and colorful, and it was a very popular stamp. Now, moving up to 1982, there was a 13-year hiatus there where there was no baseball stamp. But in August of 1982, as part of a Black Heritage series, this was the 5th in the series, there was a Jackie Robinson stamp. Now, this is the first time that an identifiable baseball player appears on a U.S. postage stamp, and the first day of issue for this one also was in Cooperstown, New York. There were 164 million of these stamps produced. It's considered one of the more popular baseball stamps because it does cross over into African-American history collections and so many other things that Jackie Robinson is part of. And it's a very colorful stamp. It's got some fun artwork on it, and it's a significant part of most baseball stamp collections. And then just 1 year later came a Babe Ruth stamp. This was released in Chicago for some reason in 1983. I've never understood why the first day of issue was not in New York City or perhaps in Baltimore, where Babe Ruth was born. But this is the next stamp, and it's obviously one where the Bambino is clearly identified in the stamp. The next one coming out in 1984 is a great image of Roberto Clemente. This had a first day of issue in Carolina, Puerto Rico, because as I like to use this for educational presentations for young people, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So they use U.S. postage stamps. They're part of the U.S. postal system. And Roberto Clemente was very proud of his Puerto Rican heritage. And that is shown with the image of the Puerto Rican flag in the background. Again, this is 1984. And then, whoops, let's get this going in the right direction. The last individual stamp that I'll focus on is this stamp from 1989. This is a Lou Gehrig stamp. And again, the first day of issue was in Cooperstown, New York. So as you can see, Cooperstown has had quite a baseball and philatelic history angle to it. But this was issued again in June of 1989. It's a great image, and it's a fun part of most baseball stamp collections. Now, following the 1989 release, there have just been a multitude of American baseball stamps produced. And just a sampling here, you can see in the upper left, that's part of an Olympic series of stamps showing baseball, which has not always been part of the Olympic Games, but over the last few Olympics has. And of course, I believe that there will be some baseball games coming up in Japan soon as part of the Tokyo Games. In the late 1990s, there were issued sheets of stamps for each decade, celebrating great moments of that decade. And the 1950 sheet included the shot heard round the world. And you can see that in the center upper stamp. Then on the far right, there was a stamp on Take Me Out to the Ball Game, the song, was celebrated. And of course, if you're going to do that, you have to have a baseball image on it as well. And this was a very popular stamp for both sports philatelists, but also music philatelists. In the lower center is a Wrigley Field stamp from 2001, and this was part of a sheet of stamps that was produced that celebrated some of the famous old-time parks like Tiger Stadium, Yankee Stadium, Fenway Park, places like that. It was a very popular set of stamps among collectors, and I have a number of first day covers and some sheets and things like that as part of my collection. And then in the lower left is a Rube Foster stamp, which was part of a 2-stamp release that celebrated Negro Leagues baseball. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, Major League Baseball this year announced that the Negro Leagues were a major league, as many of us who are baseball historians were already aware, and that those players will now be considered as major league players by Major League Baseball, which I think there's finally some justice coming around on that. But prior to that announcement, the Negro Leagues had already been celebrated by the U.S. Postal Service. Now, a question that I receive from time to time is which major league player has appeared most often on U.S. postage stamps? Now, I don't know the answer worldwide. One of my retirement projects is to create an index of all the baseball stamps that have been produced around the world. But for the United States, it is a tie between Jackie Robinson and Babe Ruth, both of whom have appeared 3 times on U.S. postage stamps. And there are the 6 stamps that are included in that review. So if you're wondering who's appeared most, it's a tie between basically the 2 most famous, or two of the most famous ball players in history. And as those of us who worked in the Hall of Fame library can tell you, 2 of the most popular research topics for children coming into the library or contacting us as well. If you want to go worldwide, you can have a lot of fun looking for stamps from almost every corner of the globe. And as you would expect, baseball stamps have appeared for those countries where baseball is an important part of their sports culture. Here are 5 examples. In the upper left is a Cuban stamp from 1971, celebrating their victory in a World Championship tournament. Lower left is a stamp from the Dominican Republic, celebrating 50 years of Little League Baseball. Stamp in the middle is from Canada, our neighbors to the north, celebrating baseball in Canada from 1838 to 1988. I really like the artwork on that one. In the upper right is a Mexican stamp celebrating 75 years of professional baseball in Mexico and the Red Devils, the Diablos Rojos de Mexico. And in the lower right is a stamp from 1984 in Japan. And although I could not include all of the stamps from around the world, the stamps from Japan are fantastic, very colorful, a lot of fun to look at. They have one sheet of stamps that's dedicated to mascots for the different teams in the Nippon Professional League, and those are really fun to collect as well. Now, you can then kind of run around and look for stamps in places where baseball is not part of the popular culture or sports culture in those countries. There are hundreds of those, and I've got 4 of them here for you to see. On the far left is a stamp from St. Vincent, which is an island in the Eastern Caribbean. St. Vincent has a culture where cricket is big, but not baseball. And here's a stamp that features Ted Williams and notes that he was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1966. These stamps are not produced for heavy use as postage stamps in their home countries, but they are printed in the United States and sold directly to American stamp collectors. And it's a kind of a nice way for those countries to make some money. But these are not actually popular postage stamps in the countries where they're from. In the top center is a Romanian stamp from 2002. And as proof that baseball is not that popular of a sport in Romania, you can see the huge throng of people attending this game and the bleachers in the background. Basically, they're empty. which is about what you would expect for a baseball game being played in Romania. In the lower center is a stamp from Tuvalu, which is an island in the Pacific Ocean. They produced a series of stamps celebrating famous American illustrators, including Norman Rockwell. And this was one of Rockwell's baseball paintings called The Dugout, celebrating Chicago Cubs not winning another game. Again, these stamps were produced for sale mainly to American collectors. And then on the far right is one of my favorite stamps on baseball. This is from the Czech Republic, 2005, celebrating a European baseball tournament. It went for 9 Czech coronas, which have since been replaced by the euro. But I like the use of color and artwork on this stamp. I was surprised when I first saw it because I did not expect there to be such a great looking stamp coming out of the Czech Republic on baseball, but there it is. And this is a fun one to have for your collection as well. Now, the Baseball Hall of Fame itself is a non-governmental entity, so it can't produce its own baseball stamps for postage. Only the US government can do that. But it can create cachets for special events. And every year for induction, these envelopes are produced and they're sold by the retail department at the hall. Some of them are very colorful, very artistic. They're fun to add to the collection. And the post office right across the street from the Hall of Fame has a special cancellation every year for induction. They set up tents out in the parking lot. And you can take cachets that you make yourself or ones that you buy over and get them canceled. The Hall of Fame takes a lot of them over itself and gets them canceled and then uses them as part of the retail operation over time. And you can add these for every year. This, of course, is Ozzie Smith in 2002, who was the only inductee that year. And years with multiple inductees, you would see images of all of them on there. But as you can see, very colorful, very well done, and a lot of fun to add to a collection. Now, if you do go to Cooperstown, particularly in the summer when it's just, it's a gorgeous time of year, bucolic setting in upstate New York. I do miss it. I can't wait to get back again, do some kayaking on the lake, maybe play some golf on the courses that I was afraid to play golf on previously. You can visit the Baseball Hall of Fame Museum right there on Main Street. And this photograph was taken from the steps of the post office, which, as I said, was right across the street. So as well as going into the museum, take a look at the post office and recall how much philatelic history has happened there. There have been at least 4 baseball first day of issues that have occurred there. And a lot of famous baseball people have gone in there to purchase stamps and to send out mail from there. If you do want to conduct more research on the history of baseball stamps, I would strongly recommend you make an appointment with Cassidy Lent, who is manager of research services at the Hall's Library. Make an appointment in advance and you can go back to the library and ask to see the clipping files and some of the other material on the history of stamps. I made it a point of pride while I worked there to ensure that there was as much information in those files as possible because it was a passion that I had, and I hope that some of you are able to take advantage of that. And then I will end the presentation with this fun little slide, which has the Hall's logo on the left and the 2017 baseball stamp on the right. And I think it's kind of a fun piece and a fun way to pull all of this together. And with that, I will finish. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you're able to learn something new about baseball and postage stamps, and that you, if you're not already collecting them, that you'll consider this as a fun thing to add to your baseball collection. So Bruce, let me stop the share here. And how are we looking? I think we're back to the regular screen, correct?
We are. That was fascinating for me. You know, I think I may have told you I kind of dabbled in stamp collecting back in the mid to late 70s. And then I for whatever reason, I shifted away from that and I really got into baseball card collecting, but stamps have always fascinated me. Something you said near the beginning was really remarkable to me. I would have guessed in the history of stamps, a couple of hundred baseball stamps. You said there have been over 1,000. So if somebody wanted to just focus on this one area, I mean, that would be a substantial pursuit to try to get as many of those 1,000 plus stamps. I mean, that's a pretty good subset right there.
It is, and it's a great way to learn geography as well, because you're going to be pulling stamps from the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean to China, to countries in Africa, South America, the Caribbean. You will have to go around the globe to identify all these stamps. It used to be quite a challenge. Today with eBay, if you know what you're looking for, you can do it. And I hope within the next year or two that I can pull together this index I'm working on and make that available to people as a checklist for stamps. But some of the countries that don't play baseball on a regular basis have produced any number of baseball stamps. And they are quite often not restricted by US law, where in the United States, anybody who is alive cannot appear on a baseball stamp. You have to be deceased. But in other countries, that rule doesn't exist. And there were plenty of baseball players who were still alive, still playing, in fact, who appeared on international baseball stamps.
Jim, do you remember from your time here in Cooperstown roughly how many stamps the Hall of Fame has in its collection?
I don't remember exactly. It's well into the hundreds, because there is duplication, of course, with the Centennial of Baseball stamps. There are multiple first day issues. And I don't think I ever sat down and just individually counted them. There's also some artwork, some research and clipping files, some booklets, some special first day pamphlets that were created. And then, of course, there are some side collections. There are some files in the Bowie Kuhn archive that cover the 1969 stamp, with a lot of samples that were sent to him and first day of issues that people created and sent to him. And then in 1939, there was one collector who sent a large envelope to all the major league and minor league teams and asked all the players to sign it, which they did. They signed the outside of the envelope, sent it back to the collector, and he created a scrapbook of those. So those aren't considered part of the philatelic collection, but they are a philatelic item. They're part of the scrapbook collection. So I don't know if it would be possible to even count the stamps if you tried to identify all the side collections as well.
I'm curious, Jim, of all the stamps that you showed us today, are most of these obtainable? In other words, are any of them really expensive where they'd be very difficult for most people to get? Or are they somewhat reasonably priced that you could get a large portion of them?
The vast majority of the stamps you can pick up for face value to a couple of dollars. They're
Really?
actually cheaper than baseball cards. Now, if you want to get first day covers, first day of issues, or special cachets, those can run into the $10 to $20 to $30, $30 range. But as far as the baseball stamps, you're not going to find anything like you would with some of the older baseball cards. Now, I say that recently, the 1 cent magenta, the British Guiana 1 cent magenta, where there's only one sample of that stamp, sold last month for $8 million. It's not a baseball stamp, so you don't have to worry about that. But for the baseball stamps, you don't have to invest a significant amount of cash to build a basic collection.
Oh, that's very nice. I want to talk about that 3 cent Centennial stamp from 1939.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, and I was not aware of this at all, that there was a major controversy. People were anti-baseball, anti-sports. They didn't think it was worthy topic to be on stamps. I was shocked when you said that.
Yeah, it was at the National Postal Museum Research Library. They have files of some of the statements that were made on the floor of Congress, letters sent by members of Congress and by the public in general, opposing baseball appearing on a stamp, but basically opposing anything appearing on a stamp that wasn't a deceased president of the United States. They thought that was really the only thing that should appear. I don't think they had their talons out for just baseball. It was the thought of, letting stamps commemorate something that wasn't, dignified in their opinion. Now, of course, you can get stamps on just about any topic you want, but in 1939, there was some notable opposition to this. Um, and they were talking about putting, a famous dead ball player on the stamp. And so to avoid that controversy, they just nixed that idea and went with the Sandlot boys, which they felt was kind of harmless. But even that, with the church steeple issue, there were multiple edits that occurred before the stamp was finally released.
I remember back in the late 70s when I was really into stamps. I think it was once a month. I would make a trip to the local post office in Bronxville, New York, because back then the post office, maybe it was, I don't know if it was once a month, once every couple of months, they would put out a package featuring new commemorative stamps. And I would buy that package like religiously for 2 years. I don't think they even do this anymore. Does this ring a bell with you at all?
Yeah, you can subscribe to new stamps coming out, and there are several levels you can do it. Some people get these hardcover books that are slotted with places to put stamps as they're produced. I don't. I find those things take up too much shelf space, and I just focus on what are called topical collecting, stamps on particular topics that I enjoy going after. Um, and I should say, I've been collecting stamps since the early 1960s, and a lot of them just went into boxes and envelopes. And now that I'm retired, I'm finally going to get a chance to organize and index and, enjoy them a lot more than I could when I was raising kids and going to work every day. So, but yeah, they still do that, but there are a lot more stamps produced today than were produced in that early era, Bruce.
Yeah. Perfect time for this question from Steve. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation and was not aware of other countries' baseball stamps. I'd like to know, what is the best way to store and display individual stamps?
Well, stamps should be kept in stamp albums, getting minimal light, and with closed stamps albums keeps them flat as well, because stamps will curl over time if you don't properly store them in an album. And you can get, if they're used stamps, you can just use regular stamp hinges. If they're unused stamps and you want to protect the adhesive on the back, which helps them keep their value, you can get special hinges where they go into little slots that protect the front and the back of the stamp. But you definitely want to store them in albums. You don't really want to put them out where they can get a lot of light. And protect them, particularly unused stamps with the old style adhesive on there. You don't want to keep them in a high humidity area at all.
We hear so much about baseball card collecting today and this obsession with condition, getting cards that are gem mint or close to mint. Is it the same way in stamp collecting today?
Absolutely. Unused mint condition stamps are worth more than used stamps. Quite often that have, when they're used, they've got the cancellation mark on them, and they've been soaked off in an envelope, and you can get those very inexpensively compared to mint condition stamps.
I want to go back to the Centennial Stamp because it has a direct connection to Cooperstown. There was so much going on that day. It was the grand opening, official grand opening of the Hall of Fame. It was our first induction. We had the exhibition game at Doubleday Field, and then you had the stamp release as well. How did Landis even find time to make it to the post office?
I think that was all scripted as part of the day. When you consider that Ford Frick was with him, that there was a photographer in place, I think that was all part of. Farley was well known for his ability to provide publicity for himself and the post office. He was a regular attendee at New York Yankee games. He was a huge Yankee fan, and he made it known when he was going to be at the game, so his picture would appear with some of the famous ball players and things like that. Landis himself was no shrinking violet, so between Farley and Landis, you were going to get some publicity out of just about anything they did.
Now, Farley was Postmaster General, right?
He was.
Was it unusual for him to make a trip to a small town like Cooperstown for this kind of an event, or did he do that a lot?
It would be very unusual for the Postmaster General to go to a first day of issue event, particularly in the boondocks like Cooperstown. Now, maybe not so much if there was a first day cover being issued in Washington, D.C., which the Grandma Moses stamp was issued there. And so it may not have been unusual for that. But given Farley wanted to be part of the Centennial of Baseball celebration, that he had an important role in the design of this stamp, and it was such a big event, he came up on one of those special trains to be part of the event. And we've got the photographic evidence to show the role he played that day.
Yeah. The one stamp that you presented there were several that you had presented I didn't know anything about. I had never heard of the Grandma Moses one, the second baseball stamp here in America. I imagine you have that in your collection. I think that's a wonderful piece. It kind of reminds me of a local scene here at our Farmers Museum, the way the stamp is presented. There's a collage of activity going on. I thought that was wonderful.
Yeah, it's a fun stamp. In fact, I recently acquired a book on Grandma Moses, and I'm doing some research to write an article for the American Philatelic Society magazine on the Grandma Moses stamp.
Another one that I had seen before, but I didn't know much about it, was the Centennial of Professional Baseball. It came out in 1969. That also happened to be the year, as I recall, that Major League Baseball adopted its logo, and that stamp kind of reminiscent of the logo.
Very much so. They would not have been allowed to use the MLB logo as a corporate logo on a stamp. That's forbidden. So they had to come up with something. It's slightly different. There's a different coloration, different color separation on it. But it is very reminiscent of the MLB logo that came out. Jerry Dior is given credit for designing the MLB logo, which is ubiquitous now on just about anything you see related to baseball. But the designer of the baseball stamp is a gentleman by the name of Alex Ross. I haven't been able to find out a lot about him, but you are right, Bruce. The images are very similar.
You talked about the Jackie Robinson stamp, and folks may notice pretty much for all of our virtual programs, we have a blow up of the Robinson stamp, which came out in 1982. For today's program, we also added the 4 Forever stamps that came out in 2012. Ted Williams, Larry Doby, Willie Stargell, and Joe DiMaggio. But we always have the Robinson here as our backdrop. It's kind of a consistent part of our program. And one of the things that jumped out, I never thought of this before you started talking about it, Jim. There is no Brooklyn Dodger logo. There's no Negro Leagues logo on the cap. There's no logo on the uniform where you see the drawing of him sliding into home plate. Do you know why that is?
Generally, the Postal Service tries to keep corporate logos off of stamps. There have been some proposals. Now, the Roberto Clemente stamp does have P, the letter P on his stamp. So, there are some things that make it through the censorship, but, the proposals, to allow McDonald's to put their logo on postage stamps, to pay the Postal Service to do that have all been rejected as being undignified. Although when you think about it, it might be a way for the Postal Service to balance their budget. But generally speaking, the Postal Service has rejected putting too much identifiable corporate labels on stamps.
All right. Well, that certainly makes sense. I agree with you about the Clemente stamp. It's beautiful. It's iconic. It's a wonderful image. I also love the Gehrig stamp from '89. There's something majestic about that one. Let's talk a little bit, Jim, about the new stamp. You did mention the new stamp, Yogi Berra. You said you thought it was quite attractive. I think it's great. I love the image. We talked about this with Yogi's granddaughter, Lindsay, last week on the show. Uh, I think the post office hit an absolute home run with the Berra stamp.
Yeah, it's very well designed, and I've been very critical of contemporary postage design for years, stating that just because you have the technology to put 400 colors on a little postage stamp doesn't mean you have to do that.
Yeah.
But in this case, you're right. They hit a home run. It's a beautiful stamp. I think it'll be very popular with collectors, and I'm hoping that a stamp like this will take a lot of baseball card collectors and turn them on to stamp collecting as well.
You focused in on a number of the great players, Hall of Famers that have been featured on stamps. I know Hank Greenberg has been featured. I believe Josh Gibson, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Are there any one or two players, Jim, that for whatever reason have not yet been featured on a stamp? You think maybe that could happen down the line?
Well, there's so many Hall of Famers. You're talking 333 Hall of Famers. And so eventually, I think they could all appear on a postage stamp. I'm sure that Jackie Robinson and Babe Ruth will appear on a stamp in the future. They're so popular that it wouldn't surprise me that their appearance happens again. But if in some of those foreign stamps, I mean, Pete Rose has a stamp, or actually has several stamps from other countries. And so, yeah, there's really no restriction on it as in the U.S. as long as the person is deceased. And I would hope that the post office would come up with more baseball stamps in the future.
I'm curious, has Bob Feller ever been on a stamp?
I don't recall.
I've never seen one.
I don't recall. No.
Okay. I was thinking about him not only because he was a great pitcher, but he was obviously, one of the early players to enlist in World War II, a patriotic American in many ways. His was one name that came to mind while you were talking earlier today. Want to talk a little bit about stamp collecting in general before we let you go. I certainly understand why people collect stamps. I think it's a great hobby. We have young folks who may not be listening right now, but will see the tapes of this program. What would you say to maybe the youngsters out there, 12, 14, 16 years of age, maybe looking for a hobby? What is it about stamp collecting that really grabs you and might grab them as well?
Well, for me, growing up in the 60s, I had a lot of uncles who were in military service around the world, and they would send my mom or my dad letters, and which would have these really crazy stamps from countries I'd never heard of. And so I started keeping them, and I learned how to take care of them and putting them in albums. And it was a way for me to learn about history and geography from around the world, which, I just kind of drawn to that. And also the fact that it's a very inexpensive hobby, but very educational as well. So between not having to throw a lot of money into it and being able to look at images that were created in the far corners of the planet just was a lot of fun for me.
When you find a stamp with an interesting subject, do you find yourself immediately going to the internet or going to a book and saying, I got to find out more about this?
Oh, all the time. There are a couple of great websites where you can track stamps from, basically hundreds of thousands of images of stamps to do research on. And then there are some websites where there are focused collections and things like that. So again, That's the, I guess, the nerd in me, in that if I see something and I like it, I want to learn as much as I can about it. And so I'll spend some time. I have some stamp books and stamp albums here in my office, but I also get online and see what else I can find.
Well, Jim, as we learned in the Academy Award-winning film Revenge of the Nerds, there's nothing wrong with being a nerd. So we must take
Now-
pride in that.
Now, did you want to, I mentioned earlier Franklin Roosevelt being the second most famous stamp collector in my mind. Do you want to know who the first is?
I'm going to guess it's another president. This is totally off the wall. Abe Lincoln?
No. How about John Lennon of the Beatles?
Really?
He was a stamp collector.
Never knew that.
Yeah.
Was he a British stamp collector, or did he get into other countries as well?
I think he was what's called a worldwide collector.
Wow.
Once he got, the Beatles' life basically took over, every minute of his day. He didn't have time to pursue it, but as a boy growing up and as a teenager, that was his primary hobby, that and writing music.
Wow, I never would have known that.
Hmm.
Perhaps another reason why the Beatles broke up, because of his obsession with stamps. Well, I'm kidding on that one. Before we let you go, just one final comment I want to pass along. It's not a question, but it comes in from Rob, a nice note. He says, nice overview and presentation. Thanks to the hall and to Jim Gates for putting this and other topical discussions together. Jim, this has been great. We do appreciate it very much. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you. It's a lot of fun, and I hope you guys are staying cool and enjoying a pleasant summer out there.
It's been warm, but we'll take it after the winter. It's always good to see Jim Gates. We want to thank him. We also, of course, thank the Ford Motor Company for being our sponsor and for making these programs readily available so that you can watch them and enjoy them free of charge. Thanks, Jim Gates. Thanks to all of our participants. Have a great day, everyone.